So in my mind, I thought, oh, we are poor and my dad could lose his job at any moment. When I brought up to my dad my tanked credit score and the card that he had opened against my knowledge, asking him what my options were to get rid of the mark on my credit, he basically told me that my only option was to call the cops on him. I remember the first car that I purchased, I bought at a yard sale, and I asked the owner if it was a good car. And she said yes, and I believed her. It did not last me very long. So I was interested in the Dave Ramsey course. However, when I went to sign up and found out there was a $60 fee, I was like, forget it, I can't afford 60 bucks. My credit score was so low that I had to call my uncle and get him to co-sign on my apartment loan. I ended up putting about $200 in the bank, and then I got robbed on the public transit later that day, and the rest of my cash got stolen. And only realized months later, before it went to collections, that I had this credit card bill. So then I had another ding on my credit. It's going to be a bit of a chattier video today. The video I had planned to shoot today isn't going to work, so I'm going to pivot in another direction. In this video, I'm going to talk about my journey with money. I would say my journey with money started at about 10 years old, and I'm going to be 40 in a few months. So a good 30-ish years that I've been aware of money at least, but I'll try to keep this video short. My dad's an immigrant from Malaysia who came to the US for college. My mom's from up north and they met in college. They chose to move back to North Carolina because my dad had a job. He actually got started in the tech industry pretty early on out of college. I was one of 11 children, and I always grew up thinking we were poor. My dad made a really good income, but because of his mentality, kind of a scarcity mindset, and also having so many children to provide for, he tended to hoard his money, and as a result, we thought we were poor, but we really weren't. If we needed new clothes, we would always go to the thrift store, no questions asked. At one point, when my older sister was a teenager, she asked to get new clothes from the mall, and that was a whole thing. She ended up negotiating with our mom and got $20 for her birthday, and she ended up purchasing a new shirt and a new pair of slacks at the mall, and my mom was basically telling the rest of us that she could have bought so many clothes at the thrift store with the $20. My mom was a stay-at-home mom and spent about $140 a week on groceries for a family of 13, and that included 3 boys. We didn't eat a lot of protein growing up. We had a lot of rice and pasta and breads and potatoes, a lot of vegetables. Our meals were basically everyone sitting at the table with a bowl of rice and maybe cutting a single piece of steak into 13 parts, and everyone getting one piece of steak to go with our vegetables and rice. Other than the phrase, we can't afford that, I think the first time I was really introduced to money was when my dad taught us any money that we earned, we would divide into 3 parts. 10% went to tithing to the church, 10% went to savings, and 80% you could spend however you pleased. There was no talk of investing at all, and the savings categories were always kind of a mystery to me. I never really knew what I was saving for. You kind of just stuck the 10% for savings and never spent it, but there wasn't really a goal that I was working toward. It was kind of just, yeah, you just save because you have to. When I was about 10 years old, I was old enough to start mowing the lawn. And of course, my older sister got to use the driving mower, where you sit down and steer the steering wheel and basically get to ride around the lawn and make $5 for that. Whereas I had to use the push mower and do all the edges of the lawn and around the garden and around each tree, and it was a very uneven yard and very, very tough for a kid like me to push this pushing mower. But yeah, I would get $5 for a lot of physical labor, and at the end of it, I would always be sweating and hot and very uncomfortable, and my sister just got to ride on the lawnmower for the same $5. My older sister is now a trucker, so I guess being able to drive early on was a very valuable skill for her to develop. For me, I think what I learned from that experience was if you work hard, you get money. And mowing the lawn was really hard work for me. As far as things I would spend my money on, I loved fashion. I loved dolls' clothes. When I would get that $5 for mowing the lawn, I would save up sometimes for weeks to be able to afford a new accessory for my doll. At one point, I set my sights on this doll trunk to hold my doll clothes. It was about $85 or $95, and I saved for months for that thing, probably years, and finally purchased it for myself. It was definitely very rewarding to work for that money and be able to see the fruits of it at the end, which I think really influenced me and developed me as a person for later in life. Oh, the other thing that my parents always told me was that credit cards were bad. Do not use credit cards. It will put you into debt. You don't want to be a borrower. You're going to be enslaved by the credit card companies and all kinds of things like that. So from a pretty young age, I learned that credit cards were very dangerous, and if you needed to use them, you had to pay them off every month to avoid accruing interest. And I remember my dad really did have a scarcity mindset, and that really was instilled into me as a kid, even though I didn't realize what was happening. He would always be stressed about making money and be trying to work overtime to earn money, and then talk all the time about being afraid that he would lose his job. He was a contractor, but at the end of his contract, he was always worried that he would lose his job. So in my mind, I thought, oh, we are poor, and my dad could lose his job at any moment. And it wasn't until I was a teenager that I kind of confronted him about it and asked him to share some good things about money, not just the bad things, because it was really messing with my head. I remember my first job I got when I was 15 years old. I worked for a couple of hours a week to watch kids. From there, I kind of took on more babysitting gigs and made okay money watching kids, but it was maybe twice a month for $10 an hour for 3 to 5 hours each night. I wanted to mention my education growing up because that did end up playing a big part in my financial journey. A lot of people don't know this about me, but I was actually homeschooled. The reason for that was because my family was extremely, extremely religious, and my parents are worried that if they put us into public school, we would be taught evolution, and that would lead to us eventually not believing in God anymore. So my mom, who was more than likely undiagnosed ADHD, decided to take on the task of educating 11 children at home. Which, as you can imagine, did not go very well. It was not very consistent. She also bought this very bizarre curriculum from these very conservative people, and actually, I'm convinced they're a cult, where basically the Bible is the key to all learning. So you would open up this textbook, it was just full of Bible verses, and it would have some little bits of things that you could learn, but it was all tied to Bible verses. And that was our curriculum for a while. I remember my mom would hand me these very thick volumes of math, algebra books, and tell me to do them in my room, and I would go up there, close the door, sit at my desk with my book, and my eyes would just glaze over. And I was not interested in math even a little bit. So I would set the book aside and pick up a Nancy Drew novel and just start reading, and that was about the extent of my education. I would read the King James Version of the Bible and mystery novels. We would take annual aptitude tests that were required by the state of North Carolina, but nothing really happens with those scores. This went on until age 17 when I graduated, and basically in the state of North Carolina, your parents get to decide if you've done all the things that they require you to do in order to graduate, and you get a certificate from the North Carolina Home Educators and get to walk the stage and get this really official looking diploma. But actually my parents told me that the things that they required me to do was read the Bible and do housework, and I had passed the test. So yeah, education was not a very high priority in my family. My mom thought it was better to be godly than to be smart, and she kind of associated education with worldliness in a way. She always was a very curious child, but she hated school, and she was forced to go to college and get a degree, and her parents wouldn't let her get married until she graduated from college. And the instant my mom got married, she went in completely the opposite direction. She encouraged us to read books and go to the library and investigate topics that we were interested in, but she never would force us to learn something that we didn't want to learn, except for the Bible. I remember as a kid, my parents would ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I always had a different answer. At one point, I wanted to be a chef. Another point, I wanted to be a nurse because my mom said I was very empathetic and kind, and those were good qualities for a nurse to have. But I didn't really have a path to get to these careers. I basically graduated high school with a 5th level math knowledge and no prospects of ever going to college. On top of that, my dad was always telling us kids that he was not in a position to help us pay for college, so if we wanted to continue education, we had to do that on our own. After I graduated from high school, I ended up getting a lot of odd jobs. I worked in my dad's family-owned businesses. He had 2 of them. I went on to become a waitress, and then I worked at an elementary school cafeteria as a lunch lady for minimum wage. At that same time, I was picking up shifts as a rehabilitation technician with a company that worked with kids and adults with disabilities. At this time, I was living at home, so my bills were very minimal. I remember I would get my paychecks direct deposited, and I would take out $20 a week as my fun money. The rest of my money just sat in the bank, and I didn't really know what to do with it. Thinking back, it would have been awesome if I had taken that money and invested it, or opened a Roth IRA, or done anything other than let it sit in the bank, but yeah. I wasn't really sure what to do with money once I had saved it, as I mentioned before. At this point, I didn't really have a lot of friends. I was incredibly shy, and I didn't really have a social life. Around 2008, when the Great Recession was going on, my dad's 2 businesses closed, and he was unemployed for the next 10 years, actually. I started spending a lot more money on my family, helping with repairs for the house, helping with food. At one point, I bought a refrigerator because the old refrigerator was breaking down. One thing that happened when my dad became unemployed was that he opened a credit card in my name to purchase some kind of MLM scheme that was about $1,000. And a year later, he realized it was a scam and refused to pay off the card. So it closed and eventually went to collections. I never got paid, but because he had opened it in my name, my credit score tanked. And I remember my credit score was around 500 at one point, and when I brought up to my dad my tanked credit score and the card that he had opened against my knowledge, asking him what my options were to get rid of the mark on my credit, he basically told me that my only option was to call the cops on him, and acted very sad, and I never did end up reporting him. But my credit was bad for the next 7 years, and I still remember the day that it fell off my credit report. It shot up to around 720 or something, and I was just so relieved that I could finally get approved for credit cards and all these things that I had wanted to do to improve my finances. I remember the first car that I purchased, I bought at a yard sale. I can still remember it was a gold Ford Taurus with probably 150,000 miles on it. And I asked the owner if it was a good car, and she said yes, and I believed her. And went to the bank, withdrew most of my savings, and paid her $1,000 for this Ford Taurus. And to me, the car looked really nice. It was well kept, vacuumed, clean, and I loved that car, but it, as you can imagine, it did not last me very long. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Dave Ramsey. Well, I never actually got into Dave Ramsey, and the reason for that was that the church that my family was going to when I was a teenager and a young adult, while they did offer Dave Ramsey courses, you had to pay $60 in order to take the course. And I remember being really excited to take a financial course and learn about finances because I didn't know anything at that point other than what my parents had taught me and little messages in the culture that I'd heard. like, stay loyal to your job and stay there as long as you can. So I was interested in the Dave Ramsey course that the church offered. However, when I went to sign up and found out there was a $60 fee, I was like, forget it. I'm working a minimum wage job. I can't afford $60 for a course that I know nothing about and have no idea if it's going to be helpful or if it's just some kind of MLM scheme or scam or something. So I never did end up taking the Dave Ramsey course. I think if I had paid that $60, I actually would have been a lot further ahead than I am now, because I would have learned about things like building wealth way before the time that I actually learned it in my mid-30s. Somewhere around 2008 is where I met my now husband, and one of our first dates, I remember I cried in this Chinese restaurant because I never was going to be able to go to college. Once I met my husband, he really helped me learn math and pass the SAT, and next thing I knew it, I was applying to colleges, and one of them accepted my application and wanted to give me a scholarship. And it was a women's college in the middle of Missouri, but I went. They told me that my math score on my SAT was just below their minimum requirement, but that because my English score was higher than average, that they would agree to take me. And they offered me a scholarship. I also applied for student loans to cover the rest, and I believe one of them was a grant. I also got a work study. I worked all through college. Once as a receptionist, another time I got a side hustle in town as a photographer for a newspaper. College was very difficult for me. I felt very stupid all the time. I remember I would go to all the office hours that the professors would offer because I just didn't understand anything that was going on. Once I took a biology 101 class, and in the office hours I pulled out a list of questions that I had, and the first thing on the list was, what is a DNA? And I still remember the look on that professor's face when I asked that question. Despite all these setbacks, I ended up graduating in the top 10% of my class with an associate's degree, and ended up transferring from Missouri back to North Carolina because I got into UNC Chapel Hill in North Carolina, and I wanted to be near my boyfriend who lived in North Carolina. At UNC, I remember I went to the financial aid office. I did not have a scholarship this time, but during the time that I was at UNC, I ended up signing up for about 7 to 8 different student loans, totaling about $25,000. I also had a work-study position at the college. I worked at the UNC Press, and I had an amazing supervisor there. She taught me a lot about life and money, and she was actually pretty pissed off that I was at one point interning there for no pay, and she felt she had very strong opinions about that. I wasn't able to sign up with my friend for an apartment because my credit score was so low that I had to call my uncle and get him to co-sign on my apartment with me. And I honestly don't know what possessed my uncle to agree to do that, but I'm so grateful to him for doing that. And I never missed a payment because I was so afraid that my uncle was going to have to cover something, and I didn't want that to happen. I remember in college was the first time that I attempted budgeting, and it did not go well. I basically was making such a low income that I planned out how much it was going to cost me to have all the things that I needed, all the basic necessities, and ended up with a number that was more than what I earned each week. And so I basically threw the budget away and gave up, and instead started charging things on a credit card. I never did go into credit card debt per se. I did end up doing a lot of credit card float, which is basically where you spend in one month and then you pay it off in another month when you have enough money saved up. The credit card cycle is about 45 days long, so I would have about 45 days to be able to make enough money to cover the statement balance only, not the current balance. I only was able to cover the statement balance. But because I forced myself to never miss the statement balance, I never technically went into credit card debt. Even though I did get really close sometimes, it would always end up working out, where I would get a letter in the mail from a friend with some cash in it, or I would go home to visit friends and family and get money then. My parents were very worried when I went to college that I was going to get brainwashed and turn away from my beliefs and all this very dramatic stuff. I feel when I went to college is when I became myself. I really developed my mind and learned different perspectives of things and figured out what I actually believed instead of just accepting what was told to me. In college is where I really learned how to investigate into different topics deeply and make a decision about which perspective I felt most aligned with. And I really broke out of my shell and became extroverted. I was active in a lot of clubs and student government and eventually became president of the SGA. I studied abroad, which was an incredible growth opportunity for me. I remember before I went to the UK to study abroad, my dad handed me $500, which was very out of character for him. And I ended up putting about $200 in the bank, and then I got robbed on the public transit later that day, and the rest of my cash got stolen. I ended up reaching out to my grandmother for money, and she was kind enough to loan me some so that I could buy some supplies and food and do some traveling while I was studying abroad. My grandmother was actually a huge influence in my life. She was a math teacher and really encouraged me to become educated and continue on to college, and I honestly don't know where I would be if it hadn't been for my grandmother and my husband. They both were very instrumental in my journey. The first job I got out of college was at a law firm for $32,000. I remember I didn't have a car at the time, and I was taking Ubers back and forth to all these interviews in person at this big fancy office, and I was actually at my publishing internship when I got the call that I had a job offer for $32,000. I remember being blown away because I had never had a job even close to $32,000, and I felt honestly rich as a king. I went to my supervisor's office right away and asked her what her advice was, if I should negotiate, and she said, honestly, $32K sounds great. Looking back, I realized that $32K was actually very low at the time that I had been offered it. It was a bit of an outdated salary range for an entry-level position. This was in 2016. But my supervisor had been in the workforce for quite a bit before I entered the workforce, so maybe $32K for her when she entered the job market was a good number. And I didn't know any better. So, of course, I called the company and took the job and immediately took an Uber to the mall to Banana Republic to buy all these really fancy work clothes that I thought a professional would wear. I still remember going through the checkout line and the cashier asking if I wanted to get 10% off if I opened up a Banana Republic card. And of course I was like, oh yes, like sign me up. I need 10% off my $500 purchase. And what ended up happening was the credit card statement went to my parents' house instead of to my apartment because I had signed up under my permanent address instead of my school address. And so I never got the bill and I never paid it, and only realized months later before it went to collections that I had this credit card bill sitting at my parents' house. So then I had another ding on my credit. And that plus the one from my dad really tanked my credit score. So I think you'll notice that the name of my channel is Mystery Free Money, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that I love mysteries and love investigating and researching to the bottom of things. Another reason for that name is due to how much value I put on financial transparency. And that's really the next part of my financial journey is financial transparency. So anyway, this video is getting really long. I did not mean to talk so much. So what I think I'm going to do is split this video into 2 parts and end this one here so it doesn't get too long. In my next video, I'm going to finish the story of my financial journey and talk about how I was able to work up from a $20,000 annual salary up to a $120,000 salary. So anyway, if that sounds like something you're interested in watching, feel free to subscribe so you won't miss the next video. If you liked this video, feel free to give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next one.